Hello and welcome to our Africa Week webinar on foreign investment, managing risks to maximise returns. May I start by briefly introducing myself. My name is Alexandra Underwood. I'm a partner here at Fieldfisher in the International Arbitration team, and I shall be your moderator today. My practice involves acting for and against states and in both commercial and investor state arbitrations. And to give you a very brief flavour of my practice, I recently led a team that won a large investor state award against Russia arising from an expropriation in Crimea. And I'm currently defending an African state against a multi-billion-dollar ICC claim brought by a foreign investor in the telecoms space. Before I introduce you to our fantastic panel, I just wanted to say a brief few words about Fieldfisher's international arbitration team, which comprises 80 lawyers across our 22 European offices, including our most recently opened Vienna office. We collaborate in cross-border teams with local lawyers to deliver results in jurisdictions across the globe. The team has significant experience in both commercial and investor state arbitrations under all the major rules. And as of August 2022, so we're about a year out of date on that, the total value of our portfolio of cases was about $16.5 billion. We're also a team that punches above our weight. Members of our team sit as arbitrators and have been appointed to leadership roles in various arbitral institutions. These include the ICC International Court of Arbitration Deputy Counsel in Paris, Chair of the ICC UK Committee for Arbitration and ADR sitting next to me, a faculty member of HKIAC Tribunal Secretary Accreditation Programme. We have a member of ICA Publications Committee and a member of the CIR Singapore branch and Secretary of ARCAN. So a salubrious bunch. Anyway, that's enough about your hosts. I would like now to introduce our amazing panel, and I would like to thank who I'd like to thank for joining us today. So first, may I introduce Leo Temeru. Leo is an independent arbitrator and expert in Africa-focused international arbitration. As the founder of International Arbitration Africa, or IARB Africa, the information platform for African arbitration, Leo plays an important role in the development of arbitration in the continent. She is a court member of the ICC International Court. She is listed on the panel of arbitrators in a number of arbitration centres around the world. And named as one of Africa's 30 most promising arbitration practitioners, she regularly consults on international arbitration cases concerning African private and state-owned entities. She advises governments and international governmental organisations on investment and policy matters, such as serving as an expert in the drafting process of the African Continental Free Trade Area Protocols, ICSID rules, and the ICSID rule amendment process. So welcome, Leo. We're delighted to have you with us today. Next, may I introduce Suzanne Suleiman. Suzanne is a partner in the Dispute Resolution and Tax Practice groups at Templars Law in Nigeria. Suzanne is a multi-sectorial expert with a superior understanding of commercial and fiscal issues in the Nigerian oil and gas industry. She provides commercial legal services to high-value clients on investment arbitrations, commercial arbitrations, market entry issues, and the viability of transactions, as well as providing commercial structuring support to clients to take benefit of statutory tax concessions, tax incentives, and effective tax and investment treaties. She has an enviable legal practice in which she has extensive experience of advising clients on Nigerian tax law worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She has advised most of the multinational giants in the digital economy space, from what I can work out, and she has also represented an international oil company in a $6 billion PAYE tax dispute and acted against the Nigerian oil company NNPC in a $1.5 billion dispute. She was a core member of the team that successfully represented an Emerald Energy Resources in an LCIA arbitration, instituted by an international financial advisor over the payment of fees allegedly earned in procuring investors and debt financing for the development of its oil block. And the list goes on. Prior to joining Templars, she was a policy analyst at the Tony Elumelu Foundation. Sorry if I've mispronounced that, Suzanne. In Lagos, which is an organisation that empowers entrepreneurship and catalyses Africa's development by building infrastructure that supports entrepreneurial talents across the continent. Suzanne, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Next, may I introduce our only non-lawyer on the panel. Welcome, Thomas. Thomas Emond Laradaz is founder and CEO of Highgate Advisory, a consultancy specialised in business and political strategies, crisis and litigation communications, and reputation management. Over the last 20 years, Thomas has advised dozens of presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, and prominent individuals on their reputation, international relations, communication, and crisis management throughout the world. And before setting up Highgate, Thomas was managing director at Mercury and executive director at APCO Worldwide, where he built and led APCO Global Solutions, a global practice specialised in reputation and geopolitical challenges. Thomas also served as an advisor to Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili in Tbilisi and Bulgarian Prime Minister Simeon Saks-Coburg in Sofia. He worked 5 years as Chief of Staff of Viktor Pinchuk, a prominent Ukrainian investor and philanthropist. Thomas, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And finally, may I introduce our own Anya Farron. Anya almost needs no introduction, but she is a partner in our international arbitration group at Fieldfisher and the current chair of the ICC UK Committee on Arbitration and ADR. Anya has acted as counsel under all of the major arbitration rules. She sits as an arbitrator and as a member of Arbitrar. Anya has a long history of working on Africa-related cases, and she's also spent 2 years working at one of the largest third-party funders. So welcome to all of the panel. We have an exciting and full agenda today, and my role is to keep us vaguely to time. So I apologise in advance if I have to interject. I would like to say to those joining us today that please feel free to ask questions on the chat. We shall endeavour to answer them at the end of the webinar. If we don't get the chance to answer your questions today, we will endeavour to follow up with you afterwards. So please do raise as many questions as you would like. I suggest we start by discussing the opportunities and developments in relation to energy investments in Africa. Leo, foreign direct investment into Africa has been reaching new highs, with $83 billion invested in 2021. What does the foreign direct investment landscape look like in Africa at the moment? And how do you see that evolving as the world transitions to cleaner energy sources?
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Well, let's start with one thing. Foreign direct investment has been, slowly growing over the past about 20 years, but sharply in the past about 5 to 10 years. And the reason for that is, if you see, how things are evolving in different parts of the world, Africa is really becoming, contrary to what the stereotype is, the safer place to invest, the safer place to have your returns guaranteed. So in that sector, that isn't, that's really important. But moving forward, there's consistent growth in the continent because there's a large population, but there's also, we're leapfrogging from where we used to be to where the world currently now is. So we're skipping a few steps, but there's still a lot. So there's a lot of airports to be built. So infrastructure is actually one of the largest investment areas in the continent. There's still the classic area, which is obviously extractive and natural resources, still is actually the top 3, if not the top 2 area of investment in the sector. So oil and gas, mining, etc. All of that is still there. So that growth will consistently go, and I don't see a trend of anything going down despite some of the instabilities we're seeing, particularly in my region of the world. I'm from Ethiopia. The East is having a bit of a difficult moment at the moment, but regardless of that, that trend of actually investment coming into the continent will continue to grow, and that's what I think we all see.
Thanks, Lou. And how, Anya, how do you see the transition from towards clean energy impacting on investment and the risks of investments in Africa?
Well, I mean, it definitely impacts investment. I mean, the push towards net zero emissions by states and, you know, global majors alike has increased the global demand for the minerals that are required for this development, you know, including solar, wind, electric vehicles, battery storage, and so on. And they're dependent on the mining of minerals such as, you know, cobalt, copper, graphite, and lithium. And Africa is obviously one of the largest sources of undeveloped reserves of this. So, I mean, currently, minerals apparently account for 70% of exports, but we can, you know, you can see that that's only going to grow. And certainly a lot of development and a lot of projects, I think, were hindered during COVID, but now post-COVID, I think there's a willingness both on the side of African states and obviously also investors to push forward with new projects. So the second part of your question was in relation to risk.
Yes.
I mean, that we could go on for a long time in terms of risks related to, you know, investment, not only in Africa, but obviously anywhere. But COVID had a huge impact. Obviously, that many people were plunged into poverty. So, and I think Africa is said to have lost something in the region of 70 billion in terms of, you know, economic harm during that period. So obviously there will be some sort of security issues in relation to that. Equally, you know, who's going to be investing? I think China is Africa's currently largest trading partner, but that's that you know may be changing in the background. I think there is new investment perhaps coming from the US and even apparently Russia. Equally, we're looking at the Saudis, for example, very interested in investing in minerals and so on in Africa. But equally, all of that funding will have, you know, all of those funds or loans will have to be repaid. So relevant issues related to that.
Thank you. And the energy transition will obviously involve some political risk for investors. Thomas, can I ask you a bit about managing that risk at the point of investment? So what kind of due diligence would you advise clients to be doing at the outset so that they can be in a better position if things go wrong?
Absolutely. Well, from that perspective, I think Africa is no different from other continents, where before entering into any deal, you need to have in-depth due diligence about the business partners, about the local environment, about the position of the government. And we've seen a very large number of disputes which could have been avoided if the client had done proper due diligence upfront beforehand. So it's critical in Africa, but I think it's critical in every part of the world. It's critical in the UK, in the EU, in the US. You want to know who you're dealing with. You want to know who are the stakeholders, who have a direct or indirect involvement, and you want to know what's the political risk associated with the local government, with the national government, with the opposition, so that you can anticipate and mitigate risks. The danger is to arrive blind to a situation and then suddenly awake to a mega crisis. So whenever you can prevent that and mitigate the risk, you're always much stronger and you're saving much more money.
Yeah. Yeah, and we get clients coming to us all the time asking us how to go about doing that due diligence and what kinds of things they should be looking at. And we recommend looking at the host state's track record on how they approach foreign direct investment. Are they a signatory to the New York Convention, to the ICSID Convention? Have a look at publicly available legal judgments. And award compliance.
Absolutely, and I would always recommend to use economic intelligence firms to try to find some information about the people you're about to do business with, and try to uncover what is their track record, what do people on the market think about them, what is their reputation, And very often, business decisions for large investments are made on factual elements, but also about more, I would say, feelings about, is this person trustworthy or not? And nothing beats to try to find what the people on the market are thinking about this person. What is the track record? Has this partner already been in disputes with many other partners or not? But from that perspective, Africa is no different from any other continent.
Yeah, but we often approach local lawyers in whatever jurisdiction the client is looking to invest in and ask them for their impressions of how independent the courts are, how stable the regulation is, what changes they foresee coming in the short and medium term, so that you can anticipate the things that might change during the course of the engagement.
Absolutely, and the weaker the judiciary is in a given market, the stronger and the deepest you need to build the trust with your potential partner in order to reduce and mitigate the risk.
And another thing that obviously as lawyers we think of to mitigate the risk is investment treaty protection, but also other types of protection such as investment agreements and project agreements. But if we start with the investment treaty protection that's available, could I ask Leo, could you outline for us the key treaties and structures that investors should consider when investing in the region, and the recent developments that you've been involved in with the Africa Protocol?
Sure. I mean, there's your classic bilateral investment treaties, right? So Africa is about, signatory to about, 1,000. About a third of the BITs that have been signed in the world are with an African country. And that shows that was, Africa's way of showing its trustworthiness to say, look, I will provide your investors with protection, just send them my way. Now, there's obviously different generations of bilateral investment treaties. And within those BITs, so we have to separate the investment into, right? So there's the investment from foreign, third-party countries, non-African countries, and then you have investment from within African countries. Now, for the foreign investment countries, for the FDIs, we have the BITs, and then a lot of countries also have separate contracts directly with the foreign investment, the foreign investor, that then, so as to provide a larger and more kind of unique protection to that investment. When you come to the intra-Africa investment, the way we'd gone about it was, there are about 300 BITs between African countries themselves. And that's not a small number. That's about a third of the BITs we've signed with the world. And, when you think about that, it shows you that there was really a lacking system to protect African investors, and the focus was really on foreign investment that was coming from non-African investment. So as time is going, what we're seeing is there is foreign direct investment from third-party countries, but we are now in a space where we're seeing a lot of investment from within African countries. And although Africa is the continent that trades the least with itself, there's now what we have, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the agreement that is supposed to help African countries invest within themselves. So part of the novelties in that is, the African, the African investment space is really mostly controlled by, for example, the Dangotes, the Tony Elumelus are able to actually invest without the necessity of being supported because they have direct access to government. They're already in touch with their own governments. The goal is to actually get small and medium entities to actually invest within these countries. Those are the companies that need the protection. The larger ones are fine. So that's one aspect. But as Africa's strategy was first to have foreign investment, because the colonial history has a huge impact on where investment comes from. Then we moved into saying, let's break up the continent in about 5 different regions where we are now going to have regional economic agreements, and those agreements will facilitate investments within those regions. And once those economic agreements within the regions are perfectly going well, then we will go into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Unfortunately, the different regional agreements haven't gone great well. You have different investment protocols, for example, from ECOWAS, which is the Western African States Union. Then you have, investment agreements such as the SADC Model Bilateral Investment Treaty, or even the investment protocol of SADC, which no longer is, which were also to, encourage investment. And then you have the East Africa one, you have the North African bloc. So these are different treaties that you would have to take into consideration. But I think now with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that will be the over-encompassing one. And as to be the over-encompassing one, what the investment protocol of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is doing is it has asked that within 5 years of it coming into force, which was passed with the African Union Commission in February at the Heads of State meeting. Within 5 years, all intra-Africa BITs would now have to be cancelled. They not only have to be cancelled, all of their sunset clauses will now have to be cancelled. So that pretty much leaves you with just a few treaties, which is you have the BITs with third-party countries, and you have the investment protocol for intra-Africa investment. But I think outside of that, it's also very important to note that a lot of countries do direct contracts, particularly in the mining and in the extractive sector, with the governments that have much larger and much more robust protection for their investments.
Thank you. And what happens to the regional arbitration treaties, so ECOWAS, and etc.?
Yeah.
Do they continue to have impact?
Yeah, so those ones actually, I mean, they will still be in force. My understanding is, for practical purposes, those will have to start, kind of fading away. As the investment protocol of the CFTA really comes, as trading really across the continent through the CFTA becomes something, is normalized, then and there are more infrastructures in between different African countries to be able to invest within them, I think those investment protocols will slowly fade away. Now, the challenge is, in many instances, and you can take the example of the investment protocol of ECOWAS, or even some of the trading rules in the East African community, the investment protocol of the CFTA does not provide as good a quote unquote as good a protection as it does as the other two investment regimes do. So the investment protocol of the CFTA, which is very much ahead of its time, provides protections like MFN, against expropriation, etc. But there are very specific exceptions that make it so that the ECOWAS investment protocol provides a better protection regime. So why would one invest through the CFTA if one can easily invest through the ECOWAS investment protocol and it has better protection for it? So that's one challenge that I potentially see coming. Moving forward, there was a lot of foreign companies that were very eager in hearing how we would qualify, how an investment would qualify as an African investment to be able to invest through the CFTA. And, their understanding was there will be a better investment regime through the CFTA. Now, what we're seeing is with some of the exceptions in the protection regime that is coming into place, and the existing BITs, first generation, second generation BITs that are still around, that are pretty, vague, therefore robust in their protection, foreign investors are now, even African investments can now use these foreign, BITs to qualify through them to be able to invest in the continent, which could severely weaken the CFTA itself. So, these are some of the considerations we'd have to look at. But I think, if all goes according to the CFTA Secretariat's plan, is the main one will be the investment protocol of the CFTA, and all the others will slowly kind of join into that protocol.
That unified system, yeah, that's really interesting. And obviously, I assume it's still open to clients to agree investment agreements with particular governments, which might give them some protections around the stability of key regulations and legislation, perhaps some sovereign immunity waivers that would give it additional protections. And I was interested to read when preparing for this webinar that about 2/3 of the investor-state disputes against African states come from investors from Europe. So maybe we're either particularly litigious or we're particularly discriminated against in some way, which seems unlikely. But I just wondered how that is impacting the views of African states on the IFD mechanisms that are in place for FDIs. And Suzanne, what do you see African states moving away from bilateral investment treaties generally in the way that South Africa has done?
I mean, so this is the logic. Oops, sorry, can you hear me?
Sorry, Leah, I was just going to ask Suzanne for her comments on that first, just because she hasn't had a chance to speak yet. So
that's totally fine. Okay, so I wanted to state that the starting point on this issue is that, as Leah has pointed out, African states have provided in many ways and very heavily with a lot of third-party countries and even within Africa a sort of protection for investors. But what happens when you have the norm being the traditional BITs is that with the advent of disputes increasingly being higher and a lot of those disputes having African states being the main respondent states when it comes to evaluating excuse me, sorry, I had an interruption here. Evaluating the number of state respondents arbitrations that exist. What Africa started to complain about was there was seemingly a lack of transparency in the process. There was also seemingly a investors feeling that they could impose their own preferences or their own host state home state preferences on the administrative decisions that African countries would make. So that sort of led the current debate, which is ongoing and of course championed by South Africa, removing itself from most of its BITs and going ahead to actually promulgate a law to nationalize its own investment protection. And it's not the only state that has done that. SADC member states, for example, agreed to also remove themselves away from that kind of thinking. Tanzania and Namibia also have taken similar steps. But what you would find, like Leyu actually mentioned, is that when it comes to making a decision as to the investment decisions, the jury is still out as to whether the BITs are actually majorly, I guess, game changing when it comes to actually making a decision as to whether to invest in a particular country or not. And apart from that, although the BITs exist, a lot of the major investor-driven activity comes from industries where investors would actually insist on protectionist measures being given to them directly. In Nigeria, for example, economic stabilization clauses are very common, and you would find investors insisting on having that kind of protection provided in their agreements with the government, regardless of the fact that there are national legislations that protect investments or bilateral treaties that exist. So yes, you may find that a number of countries are moving away from it. In terms of how that affects investments going forward, in fact, in terms of the impact that has on investments going forward, research hasn't really shown anything. In our own personal experience, we haven't seen investors realizing or making a decision to not invest in Nigeria, for example, maybe in like the oil sector in Nigeria, simply because there's no BIT, even though Nigeria is not one of the countries that is currently considering it. But another thing that you find, and maybe the AFCT is actually one that encouraged this kind of thinking, is that a number of countries are starting to realize that they need to actually rationalize these BITs in relation to their own state policies. For example, in Nigeria, there's a policy position that has been taken that you can't have a commercial arbitration agreement company with the Nigerian state and have the arbitration seated outside of Nigeria. So they're starting to tell themselves that, you know, where we had to realize that these are negotiating points, and since they are negotiating points, everything is up for grabs, and you know, we can come to the table to actually determine how your investment is protected. And you know, it was actually interesting to read recently that even the argument is sort of supported by the research. The argument of African states sort of supported by the research when you look at the kinds of you know, ISDS issues that are actually submitted to arbitration institutions, because one actually sees that most of the cases are not in relation to direct expropriation. Most of the cases are not in relation to you know, human rights challenges or things like that. It's usually in relation to indirect expropriation or looking for monetary compensation for some infringement of interest. So the argument is, if that is the case, if monetary damages can actually solve that, why should an African state hold itself out to give the most protections possible when it can give, I guess, you know, one that aligns with the state policies, and at the same time, you know, ensure that your investments are still protected.
Yeah, and those will be important considerations as states want to retain enough right to regulate in order to transition. I mean, transition from an oil and gas industry into a renewables industry is in some cases going to involve some tough legislative decisions and a lot of pressure from communities, a lot of political pressure on government. So I can see the attractiveness of trying to perhaps focus the protections that investors get, rather than having this kind of more umbrella protections provided by bilateral investment treaties. So I think that it's an interesting development, and obviously it's also happening in Europe with people withdrawing, various states withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty. So it's an interesting time. Which brings us nicely and neatly on to dispute resolution mechanisms that are available across the continent. There's been a big development in arbitration across Africa, and I thought it would be useful, Leo, if you could just outline how it's developed, how many states have been adopting the model, the UNCITRAL model laws, and what our arbitral institutions are coming to the fore in Africa.
I mean, I think it's important to see that the number of even new convention signatory states in Africa has actually been growing. Ethiopia, my home country, was actually one that signed in about 2021. We've had Sudan join in. We've had a few, you know, a few countries kind of actually sign into the New York Convention most recently. And there's also many new legislations that are come out. For example, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, you know, Tanzania, and others that are some modeled with the UNCITRAL model law. Others, for example, Tanzania is modeled under the UK Arbitration Act of 1996. At the end of the day, these are you know, let's say legal infrastructures that are favorable and more open to arbitration and very much focused on facilitating the arbitral process. If I can take the example of Ethiopia, for example, the proclamation is very clear on why Ethiopia passed the new Arbitration Act, and that is, you know, to be able to be ranked better in the doing business, you know, rankings. And that for me is an indication that countries, and Ethiopia is not the only country to do that. Many countries have signed it because it's really one of the boxes in the doing business ranking, where it's enforcement of contracts and in judgments and etc. So, you know, you tick that box and your points suddenly go up. And a lot of countries have actually realized that having arbitration and even acts that are actually more favorable to arbitration are better for, in general, their economic, you know, health and their attractive level. So that's good to see. In addition to that, there have been quite a few international arbitration centers that have come up in the African continent throughout the years. The oldest arbitration center, you know, international arbitration center in the continent is the Cairo Regional Center, which came about, you know, not that too long ago either. So, you know, we have very recent centers. the Kigali Arbitration Center, the Nairobi one, the Lagos ones. There's a few in Lagos and in Nigeria. There's the AFSA one in South Africa. These are centers that have come about as a means of, that are international, as a means of trying to attract and take the disputes that are going outside of the continent and to keep them within the continent. I mean, there's over 50 states, there's over 50 arbitration, 70 arbitration centers. There's over 50 states in the continent. Each country can have its own arbitration center. But what's happening, there's now like a specific, poles that are developing that are going to be attracting these disputes. I think that's a very positive development. And, much like what Cezanne was saying earlier, for example, in Rwanda, there's a clear kind of a policy, a memo directive that's going around that says whenever state-owned entities or government negotiates a contract, then the dispute resolution must be at KIAC. It must be at the Kigali International Arbitration Center. And that really is something that, a lot of governments are doing. The same thing in Ethiopia. There's a rider that goes around that says, well, okay, if the arbitration center is going to be outside of Ethiopia, then the governing law must be Ethiopian law. So these are ways in which, governments are kind of trying to, let's say, mitigate their risk as well, and what comes out of that. So there is a real interest. The challenge now, in my view, is with ISDS, as you mentioned earlier. The ISDS issue is you've seen countries like South Africa kind of completely, step out of their BITs. The recent most important development is that the African Continental Free Trade Area Investment Protocol has also clearly stated that the disputes will be resolved on a state-to-state basis. So it would be state espousal for the disputes, and that there is an expected conciliation methodology that's going to be released in the coming, within the next year. So this to say that there is no ISDS in the investment protocol. And I think that is a really big shift. And, how that will affect the continent is yet to be seen. Does that mean it's the end of ISDS for the continent? I don't quite think so. But we've seen that with the taking away of BITs in South Africa, not much has changed. FDI is still coming along. Same with different countries that have made the same decision. The FDIs are still pouring in. So, but the limitation of ISDS changes a major matter in that space, which is you now have bilateral investment treaties, as I mentioned earlier, with third-party countries that have ISDS protection. Then you have the investment protocol that has no ISDS protection. So you're leaving a space, a gap between these two systems, and allowing people to choose which systems they're going to come in, because both systems will go in simultaneously. The other important point to note is very few, if any at all, of the ISDS disputes are in African states. Africa, as you mentioned, has a lot of ISDS disputes. Very few of them are in Africa. And that already creates a huge challenge. Let me give you an example. The center, as I mentioned earlier, the oldest center in Africa is the Cairo Regional Center. The Cairo Regional Center has about, in its full existence, has had about, I want to say in the thousands and very few thousands, about 2,300 or so cases. That is about, let's say, for the ICC, a case, a case number that the ICC would likely review 3 times or 4 times in a year. So, the ICC has about, close to, let's say, reviewed about 30,000 cases in 100 years. But the recent caseload has increased incredibly. And within about 15, 20 years of existence, that's how much the Cairo Regional Center has seen. So it shows you that attracting cases and allowing them to stay within the continent is a huge challenge for these centers, and it is the biggest challenge. That it's kind of the biggest mountain they have to climb.
Yeah, and I mean, we certainly would be advising clients who are looking to invest that if possible, they should try and structure their investments so that they have an ISDS protection, or at least a dispute resolution mechanism in a neutral state in front of an impartial tribunal. That's something we would certainly recommend, but it may be that investors in the future have to factor into their risk profile the fact that dispute resolution mechanism is not available. And as you say, if it doesn't impact on foreign direct investment, then perhaps it's the most sensible thing for the African states to be doing. I'm interested, Anya, like what arbitral institutes within Africa are you coming across? Are you seeing many of them in your practice?
Look, the truth is that now, as we see it now, most of these disputes are going, outside of Africa, and that's already been alluded to. So the kinds of disputes that I'm seeing, let's say, mining disputes coming out of Africa, they're still likely to be administered by the ICC or say the LCIA, and most commonly in London or in Paris. And that's for a variety of reasons, not necessarily always because parties view African seats as unattractive, but parties look for a neutral seat. And London and Paris are seen often as neutral seats. Also, of course, we've heard about the number of cases that, for example, the ICC has administered. We're looking at for the experience and an experienced judiciary as well to support that. But having said that, it's not in my own personal practice, but certainly from what I'm seeing and reading, all of the institutions that have been mentioned by Leu are seeing a growth in the number of cases. And again, it's already been mentioned, the ICC has been around for 100 years. Or even if you look at the more recent institutions such as SIAC, it's taken them 30 years to grow their caseload. So we've already heard what the most used institutions are in Africa, for example, in South Africa and Cairo and so on. They're in the very early stages, but their number of cases are growing. And certainly, I think the SOAS survey in 2020 suggested that most of the respondents that have experience of African institutions and administering cases, their experience has been extremely favourable. I should also mention, even let's say if a case is administered by the ICC, just because the ICC is headquartered in Paris, that doesn't mean that parties can't choose an African seat. And that doesn't mean that the parties cannot choose an African arbitrator. And I would say, that they definitely should do that. So an ICC dispute can still be Africanized, even though it's not necessarily administered by an African institution.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Suzanne, could I ask if you've got any further ideas about how we encourage adoption of local arbitral institutions?
Yes, I think one of the ways that Nigeria has done it is to sort of legislate on some of these issues. For example, the Lagos state, which is the commercial hub of Nigeria, passed a law which requires all arbitrations administered under that legislation to be actually administered by the LCA, which is the Lagos Court of Arbitration. And we actually noticed. So my firm sponsored this research last 2 years, and we found when we engaged with all the arbitration institutions in Nigeria that the impact of that law was that they had an increased caseload as a result of that I guess necessity that was introduced. But one of the things that obviously works is awareness and trust, building trust with some of these institutions. I think LASIA, for example, which is a Chamber of Commerce, Lagos State Chamber of Commerce arbitration institution, for example, promotes quite a lot of diversity in its decision making, in its arbitrator appointments, and that has also increased it's the preference for it as an arbitral institution of choice. Even though it's new, it actually competes very favorably with the LCA in terms of caseload and things like that. So as Anna and Leo said, the change is actually going to come in the next few years, when with the increased caseload, people would actually build more trust in the system. People would also recognize the fact that if you can get the expertise, and you're not like Anya just said, you're not limited by the arbitral institution in terms of the expertise of the arbitrator. You can still choose the arbitrator that you want. You can still refer to the expertise that you prefer in terms of the adjudication of your dispute. So that is increasingly being recognized by investors, and we as lawyers also, encourage when those questions are asked that those options exist as well.
And what can we do to increase the diversity within the larger international arbitrators? So we've had obviously an increase in diversity as a result of the female arbitrators pledge, for example, where people are being encouraged to sign up to the pledge, put to their clients a balanced option list as to who they might want to use as an arbitrator. Do you think a similar thing would work in terms of diversity, and what impacts are you seeing of those kinds of pledges? Leo?
Yes, and I think having more diverse people in these spaces provides for diversity, but but also just to be quite transparent and honest, it's also difficult to be the diverse person in spaces pushing for diversity. If you are the young African arbitrator or arbitration practitioner, you just become the point person to now have to talk about it or do something about it. It's also like a huge burden to carry. But I'll say this much. For example, in my appointment at the ICC court, we have many instances where we are asked to decide on nominees of arbitrators to be appointed for cases when in the point where the center is appointing. And in those cases, I myself and also most of the African arbitrators always ask, why haven't we reached out to the national committee of XYZ country, African country, or whatnot, just to increase, to make sure we increase, and we are actually always putting that agenda of having an African name or two in the mix as that appointment is actually happening. I think the pledges help, but I'm going to say something a bit controversial now. The response to Africa's response to ISDS very much comes from how most of these centers and most of arbitration has reacted with regards to how ISDS has been held. Now, to date, as I mentioned, there have been no ISDS that were seated in Africa. And, it could be a case concerning Congo. It could be a case concerning Ethiopia. Why wasn't, South Africa, Johannesburg, a consideration, or Casablanca, Morocco, a consideration as a venue? Having ISDS be that thing that's far away, that comes up with a huge award that now an African state has to pay, has created a sentiment with regards to what ISDS is. And to the point that, as I mentioned earlier, in the CFTA protocol, ISDS is a no-go thing. Instead of, the investment protocol was the perfect opportunity for ISDS to be reformed according to the way in which, it could work. The same way we are, creating exceptions to MFN and expropriation, etc. That investment protocol could have been the best policy changing space for ISDS and for Africa to make its imprint, but it didn't. So, moving forward, if there isn't I'd say a closer link, even in commercial and ISDS, between the different African, the different disputes being hosted within the African continent and the international arbitration centers, understanding that for Africa to really continue being the large market, or even to even have that large market, it is incredibly necessary to diversify. It's not a matter of choice. It's no longer a pledge-related point. It's actually a matter of survival for a business standpoint, because you now have new players in the space.
Yeah, because it's not an external thing happening, but something that the African state is involved in. Anya, did you want to?
I had various thoughts about the initiatives and the pledges, but just in response to that, obviously, institutions actually play a very small part in driving where the disputes take place. Actually, what we need to be doing is pushing in-house counsel to be putting different dispute resolution mechanisms in the contracts, So I think that's the #1 objective, because actually there is a huge, I think, interest by the big institutions to diversify where possible. And if I could just mention one quick initiative, because I think it's a really good one. The ICC launched last year a Hold the Door Open initiative. And the first cohort of about 20 African practitioners were selected in May 2022. And that's allowing African practitioners, all of whom are already qualified in their own jurisdictions, to listen into or to attend arbitration hearings and to directly learn from experienced arbitration counsel and arbitrators and improve their advocacy skills and so on. So I actually think that's a really excellent initiative in sort of increasing both the education and visibility and experience of African arbitrators. But it's the in-house counsel that we need, that needs to do a better job.
And perhaps those advising them to highlight the advantages of, I mean, there are advantages to using people with local cultural understanding at lower cost base. Let's face it, London, New York.
No, and can I just add, every African lawyer that I've ever worked with has been like
excellent.
Yeah, just super smart, mostly with several degrees and super sharp. So there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be, that they shouldn't be chosen as arbitrators or co-counselling on relevant disputes.
I've always been incredibly impressed by the breadth of the advice that one individual is able to give me, covering public international law and commercial law as well. So I would wholeheartedly endorse that. Suzanne, you look like you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, I totally agree with the sentiment. And one of the things that we I guess I would call it suffer from is that when a lot of these negotiations are made, and this is a bit of a controversial point, like Leigh said, a number of the people that should be in the room are not actually in the room. So you find these high-value economic agreements signed by some legislator that actually has no understanding of the impact on the future. So at the end of the day, you are actually stuck with an arbitration agreement that already cites a European seat. Mainly because you don't actually seek the expertise that you should have at the beginning, and for that reason you copy and paste something and just adapt. We've seen that be the case a lot with some of the high value contracts that have long terms, 30-40 years, and you still have to be dealing with repercussions of those kinds of decisions eventually. So one of the things that we try to do, yes, in-house counsel plays a role in that. We also play a role in that a lot of the time they seek our advice to actually know, what should be the next step or what should be the right step when you're already stuck with this kind of agreement that's not likely to be changed because of the, the kinds of impact or the kinds of issues that may go into, even trying an amendment. So in that wise, it's coming to terms with that reality, but at the same time still recognizing that there's actually still some leeway in terms of agreements that can be made. I'll give an example of a PSC, which is a production sharing contract arbitration that we entered. We had to work on. There was an arbitration that arose from that with the national oil company, and one of the things that that eventually turned out to happen was that the venue was changed from what was originally agreed. So, it caused a bit of back and forth in terms of, the interest that we had at the table. And we suggested if this is something that's agreeable at this time, where we now understand the impact of these decisions, we now understand the ramifications of this kind of arbitration agreement on the investment itself. So can we have a venue being in Nigeria? And that was actually agreeable to the parties on the table who actually understood the actual issues. We amended the arbitration agreement and it went on like that. So, I think the problem a lot of the time just tends to be that you're not in the room at the beginning and you have to be mopping up messes eventually.
Yeah. We've got about 6 minutes left of the webinar. I just wanted to make sure that we lawyers don't only focus on law as the sole thing to consider about when you find yourself in a crisis or a dispute. So I wanted to bring Thomas in and ask you about your work, where you're looking at how other considerations outside the legal process, but supporting the lawyers. What kind of, I suppose, leverage or pressure points are you able to help clients with?
But most disputes end up in a settlement.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the way to go there is through the legal process. But there are some other factors outside the courtroom that can actually create incentives to bring the other party to the negotiating table. So what we're doing is identifying and activating pressure points to create those incentives. And each case is different. Some opponents would most of all value the freedom of doing business. Could we impact that? Or is it the freedom of travel? Or is it their reputation? Is it their political protection, locally or abroad? Is it their relationship with existing investors? And in each case, what we're doing is really identifying these pressure points and working with the client, working with the lawyers, see how we can change the calculus of the other party to stop the fighting and agree to make a deal. So I'll give some examples. One of our clients had been fighting against a very prominent individual. This was a dispute that was between $1 and $2 billion US. And we understood that actually what was critical to the other party was to be able to keep on operating in the United States. The moment we started having reports in the United States suggesting that this individual should be put on US sanction list, and the moment that a leading political party put the name of that individual in a draft piece of legislation in the Congress, it took 3 weeks for that individual to come to the table after 6 years of war with their clients. We're working on a big dispute against the states, where what is the most important for the states is actually to promote FDI. And the states is refusing to pay an award to our clients of several $100 million US. When the president of that government came to New York for the UN General Assembly, we had a video that was praising the vision of the president, but was explaining that his reform agenda was being held back by some corrupt members of his government, including on that disputes. And then when the president organized an FDI conference in his country, we had 50,000 people at the FDI conference location watching a video about the dispute. So the government was saying, come and invest in our place. And we're showing how this government was actually very badly treating international investors. I cannot enter too much into the details, but I can tell you this has led to several people losing their jobs in that country and a completely change of attitudes of that government vis-a-vis our clients. There's one dispute on which we're working in West Africa at the moment, where we understand that the pressure point of the institution against our clients is fighting was actually their international investors. So we don't need to have anything in the public domain. A letter to the investors, to the shareholders, to the board members, to the banks that are partnering with this institution is enough to make them understand there has been a wrongdoing. It is in your own interest to address this wrongdoing before we make it public.
It's really interesting. I've also seen done running of political campaigns like around election time, which might be somewhat associated with the dispute, but actually is just highlighting an issue which the electorate gets behind, and suddenly there's a different incentive to do a deal.
Absolutely, we've actually done that, and I must confess, this was not in Africa, this was in a European state. We didn't want to influence the result of the elections. What we wanted to do, because our clients had been victim of highly questionable activities of a government that illegally nationalized its financial institutions. And because there is no independent executive in that European country, the government was just trying to keep it that way and put it under the carpet. And our job was to ensure that the government would not be able to keep that under the carpet. And that would actually drive the agenda of the legislative action, which it did. And again, it completely changed the terms of the negotiations between our client and the government. Now, obviously, these tools can be very creative, but we also have to be extremely cautious. So we are both creative, but also very conservative. Everything we do needs to be approved by the lawyers, because you don't want to score a goal against your own clients, and you never know. So you have to be very cautious in that. The other thing is that everything we do needs to be highly ethical. So, you know, we use that's what we call the New York Times test. Anything we do, if it appears on the front page of the New York Times, should not be an embarrassment, neither for the clients, nor for the lawyers, nor for us.
Yeah.
So, but I think there's a new venue that is opening up where a lot of people realize, yes, legal action is indispensable, but actually things can be done in addition to the legal action. And even in an arbitration where the party cannot communicate, it doesn't mean that you cannot actually find ways to create incentives to change the calculus of the other side. And let's be very clear, it's not about influencing judges. It's about influencing the other side.
Yes. Well, on that really optimistic note, I think we've just hit our 3 o'clock deadline. So thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Leo and Suzanne on the screen. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. And thank you also to our very own Annie Farron. Thank you for joining us today, everybody. And there were a couple of questions on the chat. We will get back to you on those questions in the next day or so.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.